with the left as it is now, not as much, nor with the ambition of far-reaching social change. In the 1950s, for example, it was pretty mainstream. It was a consensus doctrine that even some Republicans could identify with, certainly nothing radical. But in the 1960s, some developments shattered the liberal consensus. Social movements like student protests, especially against the Vietnam War, counterculture, black nationalism, radical feminism and environmentalism on the one hand, and government overreach through LBJ's war and poverty programs. Government intervention was no longer just about civil rights, but about racial quotas and busing. It was not just about social programs based on insurance and oriented towards the middle class, but about social engineering to sort of bring about equality. So faced with these developments, a group of liberals dissented from that change in the content, in the very definition of liberalism, by pointing out the dangers that the egalitarian dreams of the new left and the counterculture were creating for stability, meritocracy, and democracy. They coalesced around The Public Interest, a magazine created by Irving Kristol and Daniel Bell in 1965, with intellectuals like Nathan Glazer, Seymour Martin Lipset, James Q. Wilson, or Pat Moynihan, and then a few years later around Commentary magazine, whose editor was Norman Podhoretz. They were still liberals. They were quite different, quite distinct from the conservatives, the true conservatives of National Review, say. They were not against all government intervention, but they pointed the limits of what that interventions could achieve. Still, their opponents on the left rejected these intellectuals and tagged them with the label, with the epithet, really, neoconservatives, so as to banish them from the confines of liberalism. Then we get to a second distinct family of neoconservatives, the Scoop-Jackson Democrats. This fight against the new left, this reaction to the new left in the realm of ideas, was transposed into politics as the new left started making inroads into the Democratic Party when Senator George McGovern won the nomination to be the Democratic candidate against Richard Nixon in 1972. McGovern was seen by many traditional Democrats as far too much to the left, both in domestic policy. He supported massive social programs and affirmative action through quotas, and in foreign policy, where he advocated a hasty retreat from Vietnam, deep cuts in the defense budget, and a sort of neo-isolationist grand strategy. The reaction against that evolution of the Democratic Party happened in different places. Around Commentary magazine, which I already mentioned, around Senator Scoop Jackson, a Democrat from Washington, who gave his name to this group, Senate office, and his main aide was Richard Pearl, and around a group called the Coalition for Democratic Majority, which I document in the book. Democratic operatives like and intellectuals like Jean Kirkpatrick, Eugene Rostow, Ben Wadenberg, Joshua Muravchik, Elliot Abrams, and others tried to steer the Democratic Party back to the center throughout the 1970s. They wanted to get back to the tradition of Roosevelt, Truman, and Kennedy, progressive policies at home, muscular anti-communism abroad, including the defense of human rights and fellow democracies, including Israel, and the reinforcement of American military power, which they saw as drifting dangerously vis-à-vis the Soviet Union. This is why they found themselves battling two enemies, actually, not only the left wing of the Democrats, but also Nixon and Kissinger's realist policy of détente, which included de-emphasizing the ideological aspects of the Cold War and engaging Moscow, thereby legitimizing the Soviet regime rather than trying to change it. So why are these Democrats, these Scoop-Jackson Democrats, also called neoconservatives? Well, simply because they were porous borders with the first family, the original neoconservatives. Some of them belonged to both groups, and there were also institutions shared by both families, like the American Enterprise Institute or Commentary magazine. And more importantly, they shared the same enemy, which was the New Left. To make a long story short, the Scoop-Jackson Democrats failed to recapture the soul of the Democratic Party, which in their view remained way too dovish, especially under Jimmy Carter. And so they went to work for the Reagan administration and inspired large parts of his foreign policy, including the Reagan doctrine of support for freedom fighters, whether in Afghanistan, in Central America, or elsewhere, the creation of the National Endowment for Democracy, the evil empire rhetoric, and, of course, the military buildup. But ultimately, in the second part of the 1980s, Reagan distanced himself from this line, especially during his last few years. Not, I would note, unlike the way George W. Bush did to some extent with the neocons after 2005, 20 years afterwards. So which leads me to the third and current family. In the mid-1990s, at the very moment where neoconservatism was being declared dead, especially because the Cold War had been won, a third family of neoconservatives appeared, the latter-day neocons, who coalesced around the Weekly Standard, launched by Bill in 1995, but also the American Enterprise Institute and the projects for the New American Century between 1997 and 2006. And figures like Bill, like Bob Kagan, Gary Schmidt, Max Boot, Duke Faith, and others. So this third family, the neocons, they are the ideological heirs of the Scoop-Jackson Democrats in a sense, but with some pointed differences. First, the newcomers, the younger neocons, were never really Democrats nor liberals, let alone radicals, and they are firmly located within the Republican family. It means, among other things, that they have to somehow reconcile their foreign policy stance with the electoral interests of the Republican Party, which can, of course, create tensions. And second, America's relative power in the world has considerably increased since the days of Scoop-Jackson and Ronald Reagan. The Soviet enemy is gone, and America's military force and economic strength are greater than ever. This, of course, has been a bit less true in the most recent years. Whereas the Scoop-Jackson Democrats urge Americans not to retreat and to defend democracy and human rights, the neocons are in a position to exhort them to advance and act boldly. In other words, to use American power to shape a world safer for all. So what does neoconservatism mean today, and what do neoconservatives believe in, and what are we talking about exactly when we use that label neoconservative? Well, today neoconservatism is a school of thought really restricted to American foreign policy, I would argue, that stands in contrast to isolationists, liberals or realists, and combines 5 principles. The first one is internationalism, the belief that America should be active in the world and shape international order. Otherwise, this order will be shaped by others in ways that reflect neither America's interest nor its values. The second principle is primacy, the idea that American hegemony is good for America and is good for the world and should be preserved. The third one is unilateralism, the skepticism that international institutions, especially the UN, can play any useful role in safeguarding peace, and the belief that America, as the real purveyor of stability, should not be tied down by treaties and institutions which include so many free riders and dictatorships. Militarism would be the fourth tenet, or the fourth principle, the idea that military force remains critical in the current world order, that the world is really Hobbesian, and the belief that America should be willing to shoulder its global responsibilities by maintaining a high level of defense spending and a willingness to use force when necessary. And last but not least, the fifth principle of the fifth tenet is democracy, the idea that defending and promoting democracy is not only the right thing to do in principle, but that in the long term, it's the smart thing to do, as democracies tend to be more friendly vis-à-vis the US, less belligerent to the neighbors, and not to generate proliferation or terrorism or other international ills. So this is the basic presentation. Before I move to my fellow panelists, I thought it would be worth just pointing out the fortunate position in which I find myself today as both the author of the book and the actual moderator for this discussion, which will allow me to block any unfavorable comment about the book. So with this said, I turn the mic over to EJ for his comments.
I hope that you don't exercise that power to use unorthodox interrogation techniques against us. I am really honored to be here. I love Justin and it's a fantastic book. Anyone at a think tank has to love the idea of a book arguing that ideas really matter, that ideas have consequences. Disagreeing with that and being at a think tank is like owning a McDonald's or Five Guys franchise and being a vegetarian. So I want to thank you for that. And I also want to thank neoconservatives in general. I think that neoconservatives have done more for liberalism than anything since Herbert Hoover's 1932 campaign. And so we are very grateful. Bill, you're a good man. You know, I'm a liberal myself, or maybe I'm a neo-paleo-retro, proto-eco-metro liberal or something like that. You may recall back in the 60s and early 70s, many neocons, this may have been one of Bill's father's lines, it was said that a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged, or alternatively, a liberal who's been mugged by reality. I think in 2010, a liberal is a former moderate who's been mugged by the reality of neoconservative policies. But I want to say it's a tribute to Justin that he could draw this very broad group here. He really has two of the best possible respondents here, plus me. You have Bill Kristol. His dad was the godfather of neoconservatism. I figure Bill is either the ringmaster or the precinct captain of what remains of neoconservatism. And I've said many times that Bill is the warmest, kindest, most thoughtful person I know, who also wants the United States to be at war simultaneously with as many countries as possible. And so I always love being with Bill. And Frank Fukuyama is a brilliant man. He is, some would say, a fallen away neoconservative. Others would say he has risen above neoconservatism. If some of you may remember that book by ex-communists called The God That Failed, if there is ever such a book on neoconservatism, the most interesting essay would be from Frank. And we could actually, if just Bill and Frank did it, we could have a great Hegel versus Strauss discussion here today, but that might not help Justin sell many books, which we wouldn't want. And by the way, Justin underplays, I think, the role of Leo Strauss in his book, which proves that he is part of the Straussian conspiracy. Straussians, as you know, always tell you how smart they are and how little political power they actually have. This is a great book, and it struck me coming up here that I actually have three friends who've written three of the best books on neoconservatism. One was Peter Steinfeld, whom I think really wrote the first serious book on neoconservatism back in 1979. Gary Dorian wrote another great book, and now Justin. And it's intriguing that Justin is French, and Peter Steinfeld was a student of French. He got his PhD in French history. And it may be that either our French comrades or someone steeped in France, the French are more likely to see the importance of ideological movements than others. But I say in the blurb, my blurb for the book, that you know, if Tocqueville helped us understand Jacksonian America, then Vallis helps us understand our current moment. And so I could spend all my time praising Justin and his book, but I just assume you will read it and buy it. I thought it would be more interesting, except for Justin himself, for whom 8 minutes of praise would be just fine, to note either where I would extend his analysis or where I have a few disagreements with him. So I want to start with the first point. Justin has a paper, a very interesting paper there called Why Neoconservatism Still Matters. I like to argue that neoconservatism no longer exists, at least as neoconservatism was originally conceived. And in a way, I am simply building on Justin's analysis in making this point. He has a wonderful chart at the end of his book, as a supplement to his book, where he describes